there is an envelope on your nightstand that you do not remember placing there. The paper is warm, as if it has been held recently, and along its edge there is a faint softness where a thumb once pressed. You lift it, and it feels heavier than paper should. Inside, though you have not yet opened it, you already know there is a single sentence written in your own handwriting. It is a decision you will make tomorrow. The ink, somehow, is already dry. You lie back, and the room is quiet in that particular way rooms become when something impossible has just entered them. Outside, a car passes, and its light moves across the ceiling like a slow hand. You do not open the envelope yet. You only hold it, and you notice that the choice inside is not a stranger. It sounds like you. It sounds exactly like you. Welcome. Settle in. If this is your first night here, a gentle subscribe helps the algorithm remember to bring us back to each other. And for those of us who feel there is always something more underneath, quieter truths this conversation cannot fully reach out here, the ones the surface tends to bury, that longer, softer conversation continues in the quiet room, on Patreon. Link is in the description. For minds that don't switch off, it's the room where the deeper current keeps flowing after the world logs off. Tonight, we're going to walk slowly around a strange, beautiful idea that some of your choices may have already been made in gene, in womb, in culture, in physics, even perhaps in something older than any of these. We'll touch closed time-like curves, the grammar of self-reference, the small loops the body already runs while you sleep. Nothing to solve, only a letter and a night, and the sound of your own thoughts unspooling gently in the dark. Imagine you are given a beautiful old book. Someone hands it to you and says, "This belongs to you now." You open it, and inside there is a poem you have never read before, but you love it immediately. Years later, older, softer, you decide to write a poem of your own. You write the one you loved most from that book. You send it back through time somehow, and it becomes the poem in the book that the younger you first opened. Now ask the strange, patient question, who wrote the poem? Not you as a child, because you are only reading it. Not you as an adult, because you are only copying what you remembered. The poem exists. It moves through hands, and yet no one, at any moment in time, actually composed it. It simply is, looping between two versions of the same person, its origin folded neatly out of the picture. This is what philosophers and physicists sometimes call a bootstrap paradox. The word bootstrap comes from an old expression about pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, doing the impossible by lifting yourself with your own hands. A bootstrap paradox is an object, an idea, a choice, a path that seems to author itself. It has no first cause anywhere in the timeline. It is a closed circle of information, and every point on the circle points to another point that points back again. It is different from the more famous grandfather paradox, where a traveller goes back in time and prevents their own birth, tearing the fabric of cause and effect. The bootstrap does not tear anything. It quietly refuses the question. It says gently, "There is no need to find where I began, because I am consistent with myself at every moment. Nothing contradicts, nothing breaks, the loop just exists." Some physicists have taken this seriously. In the 1990s, Igor Novikov proposed what has become known as the self-consistency principle. The idea is elegant. If time travel of any kind were ever allowed by the universe, only the loops that were internally consistent, only the stories that did not contradict themselves, would actually happen. The universe in this view is a very careful editor. It permits only the sentences that make sense with themselves. And so a bootstrap becomes not an error, but a permission. A shape the universe finds acceptable, a choice that circles back to become its own cause, without any moment where a first hand had to draft it. You are still holding the envelope. You do not know yet whether the sentence inside was written by tomorrow's you, or by tonight's you, or by both, or by some quieter authorship neither of you can quite claim. You only notice that the paper is calm in your hand. Nothing has broken. The loop simply is. For most of us, the word paradox suggests something wrong, a knot, a mistake, a place where reality should have refused. But the strangeness of modern physics is that many of the loops we would like to dismiss are not forbidden by the mathematics. The equations quietly let them through. The doorway opens with Albert Einstein in 1915 when he finished his general theory of relativity. In simple terms, he showed that space and time are not a fixed stage on which things happen. They are more like a soft fabric, and mass and energy bend that fabric. What we feel as gravity is just the shape of that curvature under our feet. Einstein probably did not intend to permit time travel. He was trying to describe planets, light, the drift of galaxies, but once the mathematics existed, other minds began to poke at it, looking for what else it allowed. In 1949, a shy, brilliant logician named Kurt Gödel gave Einstein a strange birthday present. Gödel had found a solution to Einstein's equations describing a universe that slowly rotates. In that rotating universe, the mathematics allowed a path, a closed time-like curve that would let a traveler eventually return to their own past. Einstein was reportedly troubled by this, not because he thought our universe was rotating in that way, but because his own equations could not, on their own terms, rule the loops out. Decades later, in the 1980s, the physicist Kip Thorne began to explore whether a wormhole, a shortcut through the fabric of space, could be turned into a time machine. If you took the two mouths of a wormhole and moved one very fast, or placed it in a strong gravitational field, the two ends could fall out of sync in time. Step in one side, and you might come out earlier at the other. It was pencil and paper physics, done in part because a novelist friend had asked for help making a story scientifically plausible. And yet the answer that came back was that, on paper, the universe did not obviously forbid such a thing. Physicists have been careful ever since to say what this means and what it does not. It does not mean that time travel exists. It does not mean anyone has ever built such a machine. It only means that when we write down our best equations for how space and time behave, they do not of themselves insist that loops are impossible. Some have wondered whether nature protects itself in ways we have not yet discovered. Stephen Hawking called it the chronology protection conjecture, the idea that maybe, at the last moment, quantum effects always intervene to close any loop before it forms. It is a beautiful idea, but it is still a conjecture, a hope, a hand held over a candle to see if it will burn. What remains is a soft, uncomfortable openness. The mathematics tolerates loops. Whether reality does is another question entirely. And somewhere in that gap, a paper envelope, warm from a hand that might have been yours, waits on a nightstand for morning to arrive. Suppose, then, that the universe does allow strange loops in the far distance of black holes and rotating cosmologies. It would still feel abstract, still far from the small, quiet act of choosing what to have for breakfast. So let us come closer, into a room the size of a laboratory, into a chair beneath a soft lamp, and look at what neuroscience has quietly discovered about the moment of choosing itself. In the 1980s, a researcher named Benjamin Libet sat volunteers in front of a specialized clock and asked them a simple thing. Whenever you feel like it, flex your wrist, and when you do, tell us the exact moment you first felt the intention. He measured, at the same time, tiny electrical signals in their brains. What he found is still gently unsettling. A signal called the readiness potential appeared in the brain roughly half a second before the volunteers reported the intention to move. The brain seemed to begin the choice before the person felt themselves choosing it. Awareness arrived late, like a friend showing up after the decision had already been made. Decades later, in 2008, a team led by John Dylan Haynes and Chun Seong-soon used a functional MRI machine to look more deeply. They asked volunteers to press a left or right button whenever they wished, and to remember when they felt the choice arrive. In some cases, the researchers could predict which button the person would press, up to 7 or 10 seconds before the person themselves knew. 10 seconds is a very long time in the life of a thought. It is important, though, to hold these findings the way you might hold a small bird, carefully, without crushing them into a verdict. Libet himself did not believe he had disproven free will. He suggested that even if intention forms unconsciously first, there may be a window of veto, the ability, in the last moment, to say no. And later scientists have questioned how well such experiments capture the sort of choices that actually matter in a life. Choosing when to flex a wrist is not the same as choosing whom to marry or whether to forgive. Still, the softness of what these studies suggest is difficult to unfeel. The moment we call our own choice may not be the beginning of that choice. Something earlier, quieter, more embodied, may have already begun to lean in a direction. What we experience as deciding may sometimes be the sensation of noticing a decision already underway. If a bootstrap is a loop with no clear origin, then perhaps every small choice you make is a little bootstrap of its own. There is no perfect moment where the choosing began. You feel it arrive, you meet it, you sign your name to it, and it becomes yours, not because you were the first cause, but because when it appeared, you did not turn away. The lamp is still soft, the clock is still turning, and you have not yet opened the envelope. Close your eyes for a moment, though not for sleep yet. Think of a room from your childhood, perhaps a kitchen, or a hallway, or the corner of a garden where the light came through in a particular way. Notice how quickly it arrives. Notice how the color of a curtain, or the smell of something cooking, or the sound of a distant voice gathers around you. You are not there. You are here, on a bed, in a different city, in a different decade. And yet part of you has just traveled. Memory is the closest thing most of us will ever have to a time machine, and its physics is stranger than we usually notice. For a long time, people imagined memory as a kind of filing cabinet. You lived an experience, you saved it, and later you opened the drawer and looked at what was inside, exactly as you had stored it. But the last few decades of neuroscience have quietly dissolved that picture. Every time you remember something, your brain does not open a file. It builds the memory again from scratch, using patterns stored across many regions, orchestrated in large part by a small, curled structure deep in the temporal lobe called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a kind of stage manager. It gathers the fragments, sound here, image there, feeling underneath, and assembles them, in the present, into what feels like the past. Which means every act of remembering is also an act of rewriting. The memory you have of your childhood room is not the room. It is tonight's version of the room, painted over yesterday's version, which was painted over the version before. That alone would be quiet and remarkable. But something even stranger emerged when researchers looked at what happens when people imagine the future. Studies using brain imaging, including work by Daniel Schachter and Donna Rose Addis in the 2000s, showed that when volunteers imagined possible future scenarios, a birthday next month, a walk they had never taken, the same networks lit up as when they remembered the past. The hippocampus was again the stage manager. Imagining tomorrow at the level of the brain looks a great deal like remembering yesterday. Some scientists now describe the hippocampus as an engine of mental time travel. It moves you back and forward along the corridor of your own life, using the same tools in both directions. It is as if, at the deepest level, your brain does not distinguish that firmly between remembering and imagining. Both are acts of construction. Both are you, standing in the present, assembling a moment that is not here. If that is true, then the strict line between past, present, and future may be softer in your head than it is on a clock. Inside your skull, the future is already being built out of the same materials as the past. Tomorrow is being rehearsed with the hands of yesterday. And this is where the bootstrap begins to feel intimate rather than exotic. Your choice tomorrow may be shaped by what you remember tonight, but what you remember tonight is being freshly assembled by a brain already leaning toward tomorrow. The two ends of the loop meet inside your own head, quietly, every hour, every day, without ever needing a wormhole to help them. Long before you are aware of a room, your brain has already guessed it. Long before your ears hear a sound clearly, the auditory cortex has drafted what it expects to hear. Long before your eyes bring a face into focus, 1,000 micro-predictions are running about what a face, in this light, at this distance, should look like. Perception, in modern neuroscience, has become less like a camera and more like a rehearsal. The most influential name in this field is Carl Friston, a British neuroscientist who has spent decades developing what is called the free energy principle. The mathematics is difficult, but the human idea underneath is simple and beautiful. The brain, Friston suggests, is constantly trying to minimize surprise. It generates predictions about what will happen next, compares them to what actually happens, and updates itself just enough to keep the world coherent. Everything you feel in this model is a kind of controlled hallucination. Your brain writes a draft of reality, and then reality writes back with a small correction. What you experience is not the raw world, it is your brain's best guess about the world, adjusted moment by moment against what your senses report. This has strange consequences for the idea of choice. If perception is prediction, then decision-making too is often prediction. Before you consciously decide to reach for the glass of water on your nightstand, your motor cortex has already drafted several possible movements, weighed them against expected costs and benefits, and quietly leaned toward one. When you feel yourself choosing, some of what you feel is your awareness catching up with a draft your brain has already been polishing. There is a domestic version of this that everyone knows. You are walking down a familiar street, and a friend calls your name. Even before you turn, you have already predicted where they will be. Their voice fits into a pre-built map of the sidewalk. You turn, and your body knows where to point your face. Your smile begins before you see them, or think of the moment before you speak in a heated conversation. You feel yourself about to say something, and then, halfway out, you catch it. The sentence was already on its way. You did not exactly compose it. You noticed it forming, and either you let it out, or you didn't. Predictive minds are always slightly ahead of themselves. Some researchers have gone as far as to suggest that consciousness itself may be a kind of narrator layered on top of these ongoing predictions, a story your brain tells about the choices its deeper systems are already making. It is a soft and controversial idea. Many disagree, but even in more moderate forms, the picture is remarkable. The self that feels like the author is often the self that is reading a draft, and so the strange grammar of the bootstrap reappears here as well. If your choice arises from a draft your brain has been quietly writing without your permission, when exactly did you choose it? The choice does not have a single clean origin inside your skull. It has a loop. Prior expectations shape perception. Perception shapes present feeling. Present feeling shapes the next expectation. Around and around, until, at some point, a hand reaches for a glass of water, or a word leaves a mouth, or an envelope is picked up in the dark. Some feelings have the quiet weight of an echo, though there is no room and no sound to explain them. You walk into a place you have never been, and something inside you says, quietly, "I have stood here before." Or you meet a stranger at a party, and for a fraction of a second, you feel that this exact conversation, in these exact words, has happened already. Or you dream of a phone call, and in the morning the phone rings, and it is that person, and the small hair on the back of your neck lifts and does not know why. These are the domestic bootstraps, the small loops the ordinary mind runs almost every week, without headline or explanation. Déjà vu, the French phrase for already seen, has been studied for over a century. Modern neuroscientists lean toward the view that it is a kind of memory misfire, a brief mismatch between two systems in the brain, one that decides whether an experience is familiar, and one that stores its actual content. For a moment, the familiarity switch turns on before the content arrives, and you feel, unmistakably, that you have lived this scene before, even as you know rationally that you have not. There is also its quieter twin, jamais vu, or never seen, when something deeply familiar suddenly becomes strange. You look at a common word on the page, and it dissolves. You look at a face you have known for years, and for a heartbeat, you do not recognize it. The familiarity switch has flicked off instead of on. Both experiences point to the same soft truth. Your sense of whether a moment is old or new is not a direct reading of reality, it is a signal, and signals can drift. Precognitive dreams sit in a different corner of the same room. Most careful researchers agree that many can be explained by chance, by selective memory, by the sheer number of dreams a person has in a lifetime. Of course, sometimes, the imagery will happen to overlap with a later event, and yet the felt quality of these dreams, the way they arrive with an odd weight, the way people say they knew before the phone rang, before the news came, remains part of the human record. Whether they are coincidences dressed in meaning or something a little stranger is a question that the instruments have not settled. What is remarkable is how naturally the mind produces these micro-loops. The brain is a predictive organ, as we've just seen. Sometimes those predictions leak. Sometimes the sense of familiarity arrives out of sequence. Sometimes the imagination and the world happen to land on the same note. In each case, the ordinary experience is that of a small bootstrap, the sensation that the future has arrived slightly before its cue, or that the past is now stepping into the present through a door it does not usually use. You are not being asked to believe anything here. You are only being invited to notice how often the fabric of your ordinary experience already includes these gentle folds. Long before we reached for closed time-like curves and rotating universes, our minds were quietly practicing the shape of the loop every day. The envelope, still warm, still unopened, does not seem so foreign in that light. It is only a slightly bigger echo of a familiar sensation, a moment when tomorrow presses gently backward, and the room, without any fuss, allows it. You may have noticed, at some point in your life, that certain reactions in you feel older than your own history. A particular kind of danger makes your stomach clench in a way you have never trained. A certain smell, smoke, a specific flower, a strange season, moves through you like grief you cannot place. A sudden loud voice, in a language you may not even speak, and something in your spine already knows to duck. It is easy to shrug these off as coincidence. It is also possible, science now suggests, that some of them are older than you. For much of the 20th century, biology held a firm boundary. Your genes, the long spirals of DNA in every cell, were considered a fixed inheritance. What happened to your grandparents, their hunger, their fear, their long winters, could not leave a chemical signature that reached you. Only random mutations passed forward. Everything else, it was thought, ended with them. That picture has been gently, carefully rewritten. The field is called epigenetics. It studies not the letters of the genetic code, but the marks placed on top of it. Chemical tags that switch certain genes on more loudly, or turn them down to a whisper, without changing the underlying letters, and under certain conditions, some of these marks appear to travel across generations. One of the strangest windows into this comes from a small parish in northern Sweden called Överkalix. Because of unusually detailed local records, researchers were able to trace, generation by generation, how much food was available during the childhoods of people born as early as the 1800s. What emerged was startling. Grandfathers who had experienced a season of unusual abundance as boys tended to have grandsons whose health outcomes, decades later, differed measurably from those whose grandfathers had known hunger at the same age. Something about a boy's plate in 1880 seemed to leave a faint fingerprint on a body not yet born in 1950. The mechanism is still being clarified, and reasonable scientists still debate exactly how much crosses the generational gap in humans and how, but the direction of the research is difficult to ignore. Later work by Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai in New York focused on descendants of Holocaust survivors. She and her colleagues found particular patterns in stress-related genes, especially those involved in cortisol regulation. In the adult children of survivors, it was as if a certain vigilance, a certain body-level readiness had been inherited. Not memory, not story, but chemistry, whispered forward from a parent's history into a child's biology, in ways we are only beginning to understand. Once you know this, an ordinary evening in your own life becomes quietly strange. You are washing a dish, you are picking up a phone, you are choosing whether to answer a text from someone difficult or whether to open a message from a friend. And in that small everyday moment of choosing, the body arriving at the decision is not only yours in the strict sense. It carries, on the surface of its genes, faint annotations left by lives that ended long before you were born. Some of your calm, some of your alarm, some of your appetite for closeness or distance. None of this means you are simply a puppet of what your ancestors survived. Epigenetic marks can shift. Environments can rewrite them. Therapy, love, safety, time. These things too leave their own chemistry. The picture is not deterministic. It is more like this. Long before you were old enough to choose, other lives had already leaned, quietly, into the shape of your body's first responses. The default settings had been adjusted. The instrument had been tuned, subtly, by hands you never met. So when you speak later of choice, of preference, of instinct, of that particular thing you always seem to do, you may be describing something that is only partly yours. Some of it is a loop, a quiet loop that reaches backward beyond your birth and forward into the person you are still becoming. A first, faint version of the Bootstrap the Paradox names, not in physics laboratories, but in the very cells that are, right now, letting you hold this thought as you fall gently toward the rest of the night. Before there was a name for you, before there were arms to hold you, before there was even a room prepared, there was already a listener. It could not see the world, but it could hear it. Faintly, in a language of muffled tones and rhythms, the world was already reaching you. Sound is one of the earliest visitors to a developing life. By the third trimester of pregnancy, the ears of a fetus are functional. The high frequencies of speech are softened by fluid and flesh, but the lower notes, the melody and rhythm of a voice, pass through. The mother's voice, in particular, arrives not only through the air, but through the body itself, carried in the vibration of her ribs, in the hush of her breath, in the low pulse of her heart. Long before you had eyes to meet her, you knew her sound. In the 1980s, a researcher named Anthony de Casper devised a beautiful, careful experiment. Newborn babies, only hours or days old, were given a specially designed pacifier. By sucking in a particular pattern, the baby could cause the sound of one voice or another to play. Again and again, in study after study, newborns adjusted their sucking to bring in the sound of their own mother's voice, rather than a stranger's. This was not culture. This was not learning after birth. This was recognition on the very first day. Even more strikingly, when mothers read a particular passage aloud during the last weeks of pregnancy, their newborns later preferred the sound of that specific passage over other, similar ones. Something in the rhythm, the cadence, the arrangement of syllables had already been laid down inside the developing brain. The infant emerged into the world knowing a story it had never been told outside the womb. Language itself begins earlier than we usually realize. Studies of newborns from different linguistic backgrounds have shown that their very first cries carry the melodic outlines of the language they heard in utero. French newborns tend to cry with a rising melody, matching the rhythm of French speech. German newborns tend to cry with a falling melody, matching German. Before their first breath in daylight, they had already begun to sing in the key they had been listening to. Taste, too, has been shown to travel across the placental veil. Flavors from a mother's diet appear in the amniotic fluid: garlic, anise, carrot, the small quiet signature of a family's kitchen. Later, in feeding studies, infants have shown clearer preferences for the flavors their mothers ate most often during pregnancy. The comfort food of your childhood may, in a real sense, have been introduced to you before you had a tongue in open air. Consider, then, what this means about the self you have become. Long before you could choose your friends, your city, your work, your music, tiny preferences were already forming inside a warm, unlit room. A voice was becoming your voice. A rhythm was becoming your rhythm. A set of flavors was becoming the flavors that would feel, all your life, like home. None of this is to say your identity is finished at birth. Every life adds its own overpainting. But it is to notice, quietly, that the first drafts of you were written by someone else's world, in a room you cannot remember, to a body that could not yet answer. If a bootstrap paradox is a decision that seems to arrive without a clear beginning, then some of your most intimate choices, your ease with certain languages, your comfort with certain foods, your instinctive response to a particular voice in a crowd, began before there was a you to consent to them. They are not entirely yours in the strict sense of authorship, and yet they are you, thoroughly, unmistakably, as unmistakable as the sound of your own name, which raises, gently, a strange and comforting possibility. Perhaps the loop is not something imposed on you from outside. Perhaps you were formed inside one. Perhaps the small, warm chamber where you first learned to listen was itself a place where cause and choice had already begun their patient exchange, long before you were old enough to notice the exchange happening. There is a particular tone of voice that certain adults use around babies: careful, teasing, warm, and parents will sometimes say, half laughing, half serious, "Oh, he was born like this. She came out like this. He never really changed. She was always this way." It is the sort of thing people say about weather or about the pattern of a stone, and sometimes it is remarkably close to the truth. Beginning in the late 1970s, a psychologist at Harvard named Jerome Kagan began one of the longest, most patient studies ever undertaken in developmental science. He and his colleagues gathered hundreds of 4-month-old infants, and they exposed them, gently, to a small variety of new stimuli: an unfamiliar voice from a speaker, a mobile with unfamiliar shapes, a small puff of air. Some babies barely reacted, others startled easily, their small arms and legs pinwheeled. They cried, they arched, they turned their heads away. Kagan called them high reactive. Then, decade after decade, he and his team followed these same children into toddlerhood, adolescence, adulthood. What they discovered is one of the quiet astonishments of modern psychology. The high reactive infants tended, again and again, to grow into children who were more cautious with strangers, more likely to be shy at birthday parties, more likely to hesitate at the edge of a new experience. Not always, not universally, but with a probability far higher than chance. Their adult brains, imaged years later, still showed heightened responses in the amygdala, the small almond-shaped region that helps register threat, when they were shown unfamiliar faces. Something about who they became had been visible, in outline, at 4 months old. Long before they could speak, before they could ask for anything by name, an early leaning had already been present in their nervous systems, a first inclination toward carefulness, a tendency, in the presence of the new, to freeze before advancing. The word temperament is used carefully by developmental scientists. It is not exactly personality, which comes later, gathered by choice and circumstance. Temperament is more like the raw material, the underlying tendencies of arousal, mood, attention, and response that seem to be present very early, shaped by genetics and prenatal environment, and probably many other factors we do not yet understand. It is the first draft of a self, arriving before its author. If you know someone with a very shy child, or a very bold one, or a child who seems to come into every room already asking questions, you have probably felt this. There is something you can shape, and something you meet. The shaping is real. Kagan himself was careful to insist that temperament is not fate. A cautious child, raised with warmth and encouragement, becomes an adult who has learned, elegantly, to work with their carefulness. A bold child, raised with love and structure, becomes an adult who has learned when to slow down. But the underlying inclination often remains recognizable. Something in the palette is preset, which means that when, tonight, you notice the particular way you tend to respond, to a knock on the door, to an unexpected email, to a stranger's small kindness, you are noticing not just the choice of the moment, but the influence of a very old draft, a draft that predates almost all your conscious memories, a draft that arrived with you. There is a strange, gentle feeling in accepting this. It does not mean that you are trapped inside your first month of life. It means, instead, that the you making choices tonight is being helped, and sometimes gently redirected, by a you who never learned to speak, who could not have known any of the sentences you now use. There is a small, wordless partner inside every choice, an early version of yourself who has been there since the beginning. And here again, the shape of the bootstrap appears. You did not create the temperament with which you meet the world. You inherited it. And yet, in living with it, in choosing how to work with it, in learning where it helps and where it needs company, you are also the one who now decides what it becomes. The draft was written before you, but the revisions, night by night, day by day, are yours. Some have wondered whether the deepest sense of who I am is not a single author, but a conversation across time, an early self, a shaping environment, a present awareness, all in soft dialogue. If that is true, then the choice you make tomorrow is not made by an isolated point. It is made by a chain, and the chain, in some places, reaches back farther than memory allows you to follow. Now let us step back from the body for a while and lift our gaze. Try, for a moment, to imagine time not as a river, but as a landscape. A landscape does not flow, it simply is. Mountains and valleys, rivers and coasts do not become, they exist. If time were like this, then yesterday would not have vanished. It would still be there, unmoved. Tomorrow would not be waiting to arrive. It would already sit at its coordinate, unlit by your awareness, but no less real than the room you are lying in tonight. This is the picture some physicists and philosophers call the block universe. It emerges naturally from a careful reading of Einstein's theory of relativity. In that theory, there is no single universal now. What is now for you may be someone else's past and someone else's future, depending on how each of you is moving through space, because different observers cannot agree on what is present. Some argue that the deepest description of reality treats all moments as equally existing, a single four-dimensional block in which past, present, and future are just different regions. Einstein himself, near the end of his life, wrote a letter that has since become quietly famous. His close friend Michel Besso had died. In a letter of condolence to Besso's family, Einstein wrote that for those who believe in physics, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. It is not clear how much of this was philosophy and how much was tenderness. Perhaps both. Perhaps he wrote it because his equation suggested it, and because loving someone gone required a place for them still to be. If the block universe is right, and it is only one interpretation among several, then something remarkable follows. Every moment you have ever lived is still there, at its coordinate. The morning you were born, the afternoon you first walked into a certain classroom, the night you first understood something you had feared. None of these moments have gone anywhere. They simply are not present to your current awareness. Your awareness is like a small lit window moving across the landscape. The landscape itself does not need the window to exist, and your choice tomorrow, in this view, already exists too. Not as fate imposed from outside, but as a moment already occupying its coordinate in the block. From within your life, moving forward through time, you experience the choice as being made. You feel yourself deliberating, weighing, deciding. But from a higher vantage point, if such a vantage existed, the decision might look less like an event happening and more like a shape being noticed, a pattern that was there all along, being lit, one moment at a time, by the traveling light of your awareness. This is not a comfortable picture. If you take it as a claim about how things ultimately are, it seems to threaten freedom. If tomorrow already exists, in what sense do I choose it? But philosophers of time have been careful to point out that even in a block universe, the choice is still made by you in that region of the block, using your reasons, your history, your values. The choosing is not erased, it is only reframed. The choice is not a magical spark added on top of physics. It is part of the shape of the block itself, at the coordinate where you exist. Some have compared it to a story. When you read a novel, the whole book exists at once on the shelf. Every scene has already been written, and yet, when you read, the characters still act. They still love and struggle and hesitate. Their choices are real inside the story, even though the story is entirely written. In a block universe, we may be something like that. Characters whose choices are woven into a text that, from outside, is already whole. Whether reality actually is a block, or a flowing river, or something we do not yet have words for, is very much unsettled. Other physicists prefer models in which only the present is real. Others still are exploring theories where time itself is emergent, a kind of large-scale illusion arising from something more basic underneath. The community is not united, and honest scientists disagree. But even as one possibility among several, the block universe changes something inside the listener who considers it. Because if the future is, in any sense, already there, then the shape of a bootstrap is no longer strange. It is only what happens when a pattern is drawn between two coordinates in the block, and both of them contain versions of the same self. Tonight's you and tomorrow's you are already touching, in this picture, at the level of the whole. What we call remembering, and what we call anticipating, are perhaps only the small local ways this touch is experienced from inside a moving window of awareness. You are still in this window. The envelope, in some sense, is still there, but so is everything else you have ever loved. If the block universe seems too abstract to trust, let us go somewhere colder and more precise, into a laboratory, in the middle of the night, where a very small experiment is quietly running. The lights are dim. A single photon travels through a carefully arranged setup. The choice of what to measure has not yet been made, and something strange is about to happen. The idea we are approaching is called retrocausality. In everyday life, Causes come before effects. You strike a match, and then it lights. You call a friend, and then they answer. But at the level of quantum experiments, this cleanness has, in certain interpretations, begun to soften. In the 1970s, the physicist John Archibald Wheeler proposed a thought experiment that has come to be known as the delayed choice experiment. Imagine a photon traveling through a specialized apparatus. In one version, if you set the equipment up in a particular way, the photon behaves like a wave, spreading out and interfering with itself. In another version, if you set the equipment differently, the photon behaves like a particle, choosing a single path. What Wheeler pointed out is that you could delay the decision of which measurement to make until after the photon had already entered the apparatus. And yet, when the results came in, the photon behaved consistently with whatever measurement you had chosen, as if it had somehow known, from the start, which experiment was going to be done to it. Wheeler himself was careful about how to interpret this. He did not believe that photons literally send signals backward in time. Instead, he suggested that what we call the past is not a settled thing, independent of measurement. The past, at the quantum level, may be more like a question that stays open until a certain kind of answer arrives. It is only when we measure that the past crystallizes into one shape or another. For decades, this was a mind experiment on paper. Then, over the last 20 years, physicists have actually performed versions of the delayed choice experiment in real laboratories. In 2015, an Australian team led by Andrew Truscott carried out a striking variant using not photons but individual helium atoms. They confirmed, at the level of atoms, the pattern Wheeler had described. The decision made in the present seemed to determine the character of the atom's past behavior. No signals traveled backward in time, but the description we could give of what the atom had done depended on what we later chose to ask. There are several ways to read this. One reading is that we should not talk about a definite past for particles until they are measured. Another is that the underlying theory of quantum mechanics allows for what physicists call time-symmetric influences, subtle correlations between past and future events that respect physical laws but do not fit our everyday sense of cause and effect. A third, more radical view, held by only some researchers, is that in some genuine sense, later measurements can indeed influence what earlier events were. These interpretations remain debated. It is important to be honest about that. Most working physicists are comfortable with the mathematics and cautious about the metaphysics. Nothing in these experiments allows you or anyone to send a message backward in time. Nothing about them contradicts everyday causality in the ordinary macroscopic world. What they do, quietly, is unsettle the certainty that the past is entirely independent of the present. If you allow this unsettling to sit for a moment, without trying to force it into a headline, it begins to resonate strangely with the picture we have been building. Choices you make now may not create your past in any dramatic sense, but the way your past appears, the pattern it seems to have led toward, the shape of how everything led here, may be more responsive to your present than a strict linear picture suggests. This is not physics giving us a mystical license. It is physics quietly reminding us that time at its edges is not as tidy as our clocks, and once again the loop reappears, not necessarily as literal time travel, not as any confident claim that tomorrow already exists, but as a soft insistence from within one of our most precise theories that the neat arrow of cause pointing only forward is a picture, not a proof. Perhaps the arrow bends, perhaps, on some level, the story writes itself in more than one direction at once. The envelope is still there, and you have not yet asked it, exactly, from which direction its ink was drying. Let us slow down for a moment and gather what we have quietly gathered. You started the night with a strange sentence that some of your choices may have been made before you were born. It sounded like poetry, or perhaps a little like paranoia. It sounded like the kind of thing a documentary about consciousness or time might promise and then never quite deliver. So it is worth pausing here, near the softest hours of the mind, and asking honestly whether that promise has been kept. Consider what we have seen. Deep in physics, our best equations for space and time do not forbid loops. Mathematics tolerates closed time-like curves, rotating universes, wormhole geometries. Reality may not implement any of these, and yet the theoretical door is not shut. Closer to the body, our best experiments in neuroscience suggest that the moment of choice is not a clean, singular flash of will. Brain signals often precede awareness. Perception is prediction. The mind arrives at decisions before the self quite catches up with them. Something inside you begins the choice, and something else notices it after. Closer still, in the cells themselves, we have seen how chemistry from your ancestors' lives can quietly annotate your genes. What they hungered for, what they feared, what safety they did or did not know, may whisper forward into the small default settings of your body. The way your stomach responds to certain kinds of stress, the particular timbre of a voice that makes you feel safe. Some of these tendencies were shaped by lives that ended before yours began, and within the very first months of your existence, in a warm chamber you cannot remember, sounds and rhythms and tastes were already forming the early architecture of preference. By the time you were placed into arms and cameras and a name, you had already been listening for weeks. You were not blank, you were already leaning. Then came the softer layer, the temperament arriving with you, sketched in the nervous system by 4 months old, still recognizable decades later. Not fate, but a first draft that would color every later decision. And beyond the body, at the edges of physics, the block universe and the delayed choice experiment offered images stranger still, a reality in which the future may not be a blank waiting to be filled, and the past may not be as immutable as we imagined. Whether these images are literally true or partial reflections of a deeper truth we have not yet grasped, the very existence of such serious models within science softens the confidence with which any of us can say that a decision has one clean beginning. Put these together: inheritance, prenatal shaping, temperament, block time, retrocausation, and you begin to feel the outline of the answer to the night's question. Some of what you will decide tomorrow is not being decided fresh, from scratch, at 9 in the morning. Some of it is already circulating in a loop older than your name, older than your language, older, in some strands, than your species. And yet, and this matters, none of it removes you. This is not a picture in which the self is deleted. It is a picture in which the self is more richly companioned than we usually imagine. The ancestors who fed and starved, the mother whose voice arrived through fluid, the infant nervous system that first flinched or leaned toward a puff of air, the future coordinate where a version of you is already, in some sense, sitting. All of them are with you, tonight, quietly, as you decide whether to turn out the light. You are still the one who lives it. You are still the one who feels the small resistance of the sheet under your hand, the weight of the pillow, the softening of the eyes. You are still the one whose next thought will be authored, at least in part, by the strange layered creature that carries your name. Some have wondered whether this reframing frees us or binds us. It does neither cleanly, it softens both. It suggests that freedom was never the ability to choose from a blank page. It was always the ability to add your handwriting to a page that already had marks on it. And the marks, when you look at them without fear, are not a prison. They are a kind of company. If you had been hoping the paradox in the title might be delivered by the middle of a long night, the sense that a choice can arrive with no clean single origin, drifting through generations and geometry and nervous systems, then perhaps that promise has now been kept, softly, without shouting. And from here on, we will not withhold anything. We will only widen. We will only deepen. We will only turn the loop, slowly, in different lights, to see what else it quietly holds. For now, the envelope has not moved, but it feels a little less foreign. It feels a little more like a page that someone in your history was always going to leave you, and that some part of you was always going to read. Somewhere in the dark, before the first bird has even remembered that it is a bird, your body begins to prepare for morning. You are not thinking about morning. You are not even fully aware that you exist. And yet, deep inside a small cluster of cells above the roof of your mouth, in a structure called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a rhythm is quietly turning. This tiny group of neurons is one of the master clocks of the human body. It has been ticking through your entire life, calibrated by the light that reaches your eyes, and by ancient chemistry that predates any calendar humans have ever drawn. Roughly an hour or two before you will actually wake, this clock begins to release a signal. Cortisol, the hormone often associated with stress, begins to rise gently in your bloodstream. Your heart rate, still slow, edges upward by small percentages. Your body temperature, which had dipped in the middle of the night, begins to climb. Your liver, quietly, begins to release stored glucose. All of this happens while you are still asleep. Your body is preparing for a day that has not yet arrived, using a script it seems to have already read. And on the other end of the loop, hours earlier, something equally strange happened. Long before darkness had fully filled your room, a small gland deep in your brain called the pineal gland began releasing melatonin, the hormone of night. It did not wait for the world to prove that night had arrived. It anticipated. It read the fading afternoon light and, on that soft evidence, began preparing you for a sleep you had not yet decided to have. The pattern here is remarkable, and it hides in plain sight. Your body does not simply react to the day, it rehearses the day. It leans in before events arrive. You can feel this in small ways if you pay attention. Perhaps you have noticed that on days when you know you must wake early, you often stir on your own a few minutes before the alarm rings. Sleep researchers have observed this too. The body, informed by intention, begins to release cortisol earlier than usual, so that you rise before the harsh sound arrives. This is not superstition. It is a small piece of physiology, well documented. Some inner part of you knew the alarm was coming and moved quietly ahead of it. Or perhaps you have traveled across time zones and felt, for days, the strange dislocation of jet lag. The clock in your head, so precise at home, has not yet adjusted to the new sky. You are hungry when meals are not being served. You are wide awake at 3 in the morning. Your body is still living, in miniature, in the city you left. The old rhythm is still writing its predictions based on a place that is no longer around you. There is something quietly humbling in this. Long before your mind arrives at any thought about the day, the body has already begun to lean into it. Whatever choices you will feel yourself making tomorrow, what to eat, whether to walk, whether to answer a difficult message, will be made through a nervous system that has been shaped hours in advance by anticipation. And so the small loop appears again. The you who is asleep tonight is already sending soft messages to the you who will wake tomorrow. Chemicals, temperatures, rhythms, all of them adjusting themselves so that the morning version of you can meet the world at all. The choice, when it arrives, will feel new, but it will be met by a body that has been preparing for it, quietly, since long before dawn. The envelope has not moved, and yet, in a way you did not choose, your body is already reaching, gently, toward morning. There is a phrase people use that is much more literal than they realize: gut feeling, a decision that seems to come from below the ribs before the mind has fully worked it out. And research over the past 20 years has begun to reveal, gently, just how physical that phrase actually is. Around your intestines there is a network of nerve cells so dense that some researchers have begun calling it the second brain. Its scientific name is the enteric nervous system, and it contains an estimated 100 million neurons, more than are found in the entire spinal cord. This system runs largely on its own. It manages digestion, coordinates the rhythmic contractions of the gut, and communicates through a rich chemistry that includes many of the same neurotransmitters your brain uses. In fact, a significant portion of the body's serotonin, often associated with mood, is produced not in the head, but in the gut. Between this second brain and your first, there runs a highway called the vagus nerve. It is the longest cranial nerve in the body, wandering from your brainstem down through your neck and chest and into your abdomen, sending threads to your heart, your lungs, your digestive tract. 90% of the vagus nerve's fibers, remarkably, carry information upward from the gut toward the brain, rather than downward. The gut is not mostly being commanded. The gut is mostly reporting. Consider what that means. When you feel a decision arriving as a knot in your stomach, that is not a metaphor. Small neurons in your intestines are sensing changes in your microbiome, in inflammation, in the composition of what is passing through, and sending signals upward that shape your mood, your alertness, and even, in ways researchers are still tracing, your judgments. Studies of the gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria that live inside you, have shown that these tiny inhabitants can influence anxiety and behavior in animals. Germ-free mice, raised without any microbiome, tend to behave differently under stress than mice with a normal microbial community. When the microbiome of anxious animals is transplanted into calm ones, some of that anxiety can seem to travel with it. The chemistry inside your gut is, in a real sense, part of the material from which your emotions are being made. And so, when you tell yourself tomorrow that you have decided something, to trust someone, to be cautious, to reach out, to hold back, the story is more layered than it seems. Some part of that decision was already being shaped by cells in your abdomen that have no consciousness of their own, but that were quietly signaling upward. Some part of it was shaped by a bacterial community that, hours earlier, had been influenced by what you ate, when you slept, how much light you saw, whether you laughed. Here is the small wonder. Long before the front of your brain composes its opinion, the body below has been drafting its version. The mind, in many cases, is confirming a lean the body has already made. The choice does not begin at the top and travel down. Some of the time, it begins at the bottom and travels up. You can feel this in ordinary life. There is the sudden reluctance you notice, without reason, to enter a certain room. There is the softness in your chest when a certain person speaks. There is the way your appetite dies when something is wrong, even before you have named the wrongness. Each of these is your body, in its own quiet grammar, casting a vote before you were formally asked. If a bootstrap is a choice whose origin cannot be cleanly located, then the everyday gut-level decisions of your life are already bootstraps in miniature. They rise into awareness with no single beginning. Bacteria, vagus nerve, hormones, past meals, a night's sleep, ancestral chemistry, all of them fold together into a signal that arrives, at last, as a feeling. And when you act on that feeling, you sign your name to a decision that many quiet authors have already helped to draft. The mind in this picture is less of a lone judge and more of a listener at the edge of a very old body. And listening, tonight, may be quite enough. Watch a pianist for a moment. She sits down at the instrument and begins a piece she has played hundreds of times. Her hands move in patterns so complex that no conscious mind could compose them in real time. Chords, ornaments, sudden shifts of tempo, and yet her face is calm. She is not thinking about her fingers. She is thinking about the music. Somewhere below her thoughts, another part of her is playing. Every human body carries a version of this. The way you reach for a door handle without looking, the way your feet find the shape of a familiar staircase in the dark, the precise arc of your wrist as you sign your own name. These are not decisions in the deliberate sense. They are gestures already loaded into muscle and brain, ready to be triggered by intention. The cerebellum, a smaller cauliflower-shaped structure tucked at the back of your skull, is one of the great quiet artists of this process. It contains an astonishing majority of the brain's total neurons, even though it takes up only a small portion of the space. Its work is to refine movement. Every time you learn a new gesture, from riding a bicycle to swiping a phone screen, the cerebellum builds and tunes a small internal model. Over time, it does not need to consult the front of the brain for permission. The gesture becomes something the body can offer instantly, on request. But there is a stranger, subtler layer here. The neuroscientist Patrick Haggard has spent much of his career studying the precise timing between intention and action. In careful experiments, drawing on and extending Libet's earlier work, Haggard and others have shown that our conscious sense of willing a movement typically arrives only about a fifth to a third of a second before the movement itself. But the neural preparation for that movement often begins earlier, sometimes noticeably earlier. When you feel yourself deciding to lift a finger, the machinery to lift the finger has, in many cases, already begun. There is even a phenomenon called the sense of agency, which researchers can bend in the laboratory. Under certain conditions, people will feel they caused a movement they did not actually cause. Under other conditions, they will feel they did not cause a movement they did in fact cause. The feeling of being the author of a gesture, it turns out, is itself something the brain constructs, using cues about timing, sensory feedback, and expectation. You can feel this softly at the edges of your own experience. Notice, sometime, the very small moment between when you decide to reach for a glass and when your hand actually moves. Try to catch the very beginning of the reach. Almost always, by the time you notice, the movement is already underway. The decision does not click like a switch. It emerges like a wave, and the wave has been building underneath the surface for longer than you can see. Some researchers call the internal models the brain uses to predict its own movements motor priors. These are the body's expectations about how a movement should unfold, how much force, at what angle, in what direction. When you throw a ball, catch a set of keys, or type a familiar password, you are drawing on a shelf of motor priors so deep that you cannot remember when most of them were shaped. Every gesture is, in this sense, a small loop between anticipation and execution. Once again, the bootstrap shape appears. The movement is initiated by intention, but the intention is met by a body that has already begun preparing for it. The intention itself may have been triggered by a prior expectation. The expectation may have arisen from a lifetime of similar gestures. Every reach for a glass carries an invisible history, and there is something quietly reassuring in that. It means you are not required to consciously author every small movement of your life. Much of what you do is offered up to you by a body that has been practicing since you were born. You are being carried, in a real way, by your own past self, delivering gesture after gesture into your hands, so that the front of your mind is free to think, to feel, to worry, to love. Tonight, as you shift under the sheet, or turn the pillow, or bring one hand to rest gently over your stomach, notice how little of any of it you actually had to compose. The gestures arrive already fluent. The body knows the shape of a sleeping self. It has done this many, many times before. There is a very old idea, common in almost every culture, that the heart knows things before the head does. Poets and mystics have said it forever, and science, without ever quite endorsing the mysticism, has been noticing, quietly, that something in the pattern of the heartbeat is more attuned to what is about to happen than we might expect. The heart is not simply a pump. It is deeply interwoven with the nervous system. Its rhythm is influenced by the vagus nerve, which we met a few minutes ago, and by other branches of the autonomic nervous system that shift the pulse in response to breath, emotion, and thought. At the same time, the heart sends signals back to the brain, through nerves, through hormones, through pressure changes in the blood vessels, that influence attention, mood, and perception. There is a well-documented, two-way conversation between the heart and the brain, running underneath every experience. Some of this is easy to notice. Your heart quickens when you are nervous. It calms when you are safe. It skips when you see someone you love. But there is a more subtle layer that researchers have been probing, sometimes controversially for several decades. At the Heart Math Institute, a group of researchers led by Rollin McCraty published a series of studies in the early 2000s that produced striking claims. They exposed volunteers to a sequence of images that alternated randomly between calming pictures and emotionally charged ones. What they reported was that the heart rate of the volunteers seemed to shift a few seconds before an emotional image appeared on the screen, not by much, but measurably in their data, as if the body were leaning, in advance, toward emotional weather that had not yet arrived. These studies have been controversial. Other laboratories have argued that the effect either does not hold up, or that it can be explained by subtle experimental factors, the way randomness clusters, the way expectation shapes physiology, the way we notice hits and forget misses. The scientific community has not settled on a single conclusion. Some have wondered whether there is something here that mainstream physiology has not yet fully accommodated. Others have wondered whether the effect is smaller and more mundane than it first appears. Both positions are held by careful people. But even setting aside these more debated findings, the ordinary conversation between heart and brain is remarkable enough. Studies using heartbeat-evoked potentials, brain signals triggered by each beat of the heart, have shown that your perception of the world is subtly shaped by where you are in your cardiac cycle. Fear responses can be more intense in the fraction of a second when the heart is contracting. Certain thoughts arise more easily at certain phases of the pulse. Your emotional life is scored, quietly, to a rhythm you do not consciously hear. There is a deep, gentle image here. Your heart beating in your chest as you lie in this bed is not merely keeping you alive. It is one of the instruments the whole of you plays. Its pattern is entwined with your decisions, your moods, your subtle sense of anticipation. When you feel in some hard-to-name way that something is coming, a good thing, a difficult conversation, a moment you cannot yet see clearly, Some of that sensing may live in the way your heart is currently choosing to beat. Whether or not the heart genuinely peers a few seconds into the future, as some contested research suggests, it certainly listens to the present with an intelligence we underestimate. And the small hesitation you sometimes feel before making a decision, the small flutter, the small ease, this is not noise. It is another voice in the conversation you are always having with yourself, and so the loop widens once more. The choice you will make tomorrow will be met by a heart that has been paying attention long before your mind formed the question. It will be met by a rhythm that already knows something about what you can bear. If you want to see the strangest small workshop in which tomorrow is being drafted, you have to look at what happens while you sleep. For most of history, sleep was regarded as a kind of gentle absence, a resting, a switching off, a passive pause between one active life and the next. Modern neuroscience has quietly overturned this picture. Sleep, it turns out, is a very busy place, and during a certain phase of it, your brain seems to be practicing the future. Consider a classic experiment. In the 1990s, researchers Matthew Wilson and Bruce McNaughton at the University of Arizona placed rats in a maze, one they had never seen before. As the rats explored, the scientists recorded the activity of individual neurons in a region of the hippocampus called place cells. These place cells fire when the animal is in specific locations. As the rat moved through the maze, a specific pattern of place cell activity marked its journey, a signature of the path it had taken. Then the rats were allowed to sleep, and in the sleeping rats, the scientists observed something remarkable. In certain phases of sleep, the exact same sequences of place cells were firing again, not randomly, but in the same order the rats had experienced them earlier. The brains were, in a real sense, rerunning the maze. Later work has shown that these replays sometimes run forward, sometimes in reverse, and sometimes seem to explore paths the animal had considered but not fully taken. The sleeping brain was rehearsing possibility. Human research since then has extended this picture. Studies using sleep spindles, small rapid bursts of brain activity that appear during certain phases of sleep, have shown that memories from the day are being replayed, consolidated, and integrated into larger networks of knowledge. People who sleep well after learning something tend to remember it better. People who sleep well after facing a difficult problem sometimes wake, quietly, with an answer. The dream state, in particular, may be a workshop of unusual imagination. During REM sleep, the parts of the brain that regulate self-control and reality checking are quieter, while emotional and associative networks are especially active. Old material combines with new material in unexpected ways. Emotions are retuned. Certain researchers have suggested that dreams help the brain rehearse threats and social scenarios in a low-stakes environment, running simulations, drafting possibilities before life demands them. Which means that even now, if you are drifting closer to sleep, some part of your mind is preparing to enter a place where tomorrow is quietly being written, not in words, not in a clean narrative, but in the softer, weirder grammar of dream, a grammar that recombines the day, tries out new versions, brings back the dead, and offers gifts you did not ask for. You have surely felt this in ordinary life. There is the problem you cannot solve at night that seems on waking to have loosened. There is the difficult person whose face returns to you in a dream, in a shape different from anger. There is the answer that arrives during the first pour of coffee, though no one has spoken. Something worked while you slept. Something inside you did the labor. If a bootstrap paradox is a decision that seems to arrive already made, then sleep is one of the softest bootstraps of all. You go into it as one person, and you emerge as a slightly different person. You did not consciously write the difference, and yet the difference is unmistakably yours. Your brain, without your supervision, drafted a little of the person you now are. And so, tonight, as your eyes rest heavier, as your body softens further into the mattress, notice that this is not passive, this is not simply darkness. This is a workshop opening for the night shift. It will run for hours. It will do work you cannot follow. It will offer you, at dawn, a self subtly rewritten, a little of tomorrow already tried on, in the quiet dark of your own head. There is nothing you need to do to help it. You are already helping by resting. The rehearsal will begin whether you watch it or not. Look at your own hand for a moment, the one closest to the light. Notice its lines, its knuckles, the small marks it has gathered from years of use. It is entirely your hand, and yet, in a certain way of seeing, it is also many hands. The shape of the fingers, the way the thumb sits, the small curve at the base of the palm, these carry echoes of hands you never met. Human lives, seen from a slight distance, do not move only as individuals. They move in patterns that reach across generations. Families that migrated once tend, statistically, to migrate again. Families where one generation entered a certain profession, teaching, medicine, farming, music, often produce another generation drawn, sometimes without being pushed, into the same territory. Griefs and loves have their own quiet inheritance. Cousins you have never met, in countries you may have never visited, may share not only your eyes, but your kind of humor, your kind of restlessness. Some of this is obvious. Children copy their parents. Culture is transmitted around dinner tables. Networks of family and community open certain doors and quietly close others. A child raised in a household of readers is more likely to become a reader. A child raised near the sea is more likely to feel restless in landlocked cities. None of this needs any exotic explanation, but researchers have also been tracing the parts that are less obvious. In the epigenetic work we touched on earlier, chemical marks placed on the genes of one generation can, in certain circumstances, appear in the bodies of the next. When a parent has lived through a particular kind of famine, or war, or long-term stress, some of that experience seems to leave signatures that influence how their children's bodies handle stress, food, sleep. The evidence is still being sharpened, and how much this extends into subtle preferences and personality is very much a live question, but the shape is intriguing, and it aligns with a truth many families have felt for centuries, that their patterns are older than any single lifetime. The Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study, running since 1972 in New Zealand, has followed a large cohort of people from birth into middle age, with rates of participation almost unheard of in longitudinal research. Its findings are humbling. Small differences in self-control at age 3, measured in ordinary childhood assessments, statistically predict differences in adult health, wealth, and relationship stability decades later. Not perfectly, not deterministically, but with enough clarity to make thoughtful researchers pause. What appears in a 5-year-old, the ability to wait, to plan, to soothe, is not confined to those years. It sends ripples down a whole life. Read those ripples inside a family tree, and something strange emerges. Certain qualities that seem intensely personal, a fierce protectiveness, a tendency toward quiet melancholy, a natural instinct for organization, often echo across generations. Grandparents you never spoke to were sometimes described in words that could be used, without change, to describe you now. Their marriages ended in certain patterns that resemble your own. Their careers turned, at certain ages, in directions that mirror yours. The trajectory of a life is not entirely composed by the person living it. None of this means that you are locked into an ancestral track. Lives can pivot in ways their forebears could never have anticipated. Someone in every family often becomes the one who breaks a pattern, the first to leave, the first to speak, the first to heal, the first to refuse a way of being that had continued for centuries. And that person, too, changes what descends. Their small courage becomes the new inheritance. But acknowledging the ancestral loop does something soft to the ordinary sense of decision. When you tell yourself tomorrow that you will pursue a certain path, or return to an old habit, or refuse a temptation, some part of that choice is being made in company. You are being nudged, without seeing them, by the many people who, in some version of the same situation, chose one way or another. You're also, in some cases, being invited to complete a decision they began but could not finish. You are picking up a pen someone else left on the table. Some have wondered whether we are ever entirely the authors of our own lives, or whether we are more like translators, taking the drafts our ancestors made in the language of their own century and rewriting them, imperfectly, in the language of our own. If that is so, then the Bootstrap Paradox of the title becomes, once again, quietly domestic. Some of tomorrow's choice is a translation, some of it is a revision, some of it may be, at last, the fresh sentence that no one before you was able to write, and here, gently, is the wonder. You are not required to know which is which, you are only required to live it. Now try something small and strange. Say your first language in your head, the one you dreamed in as a child. Notice how effortlessly it arrives, how it does not feel like a set of rules, but like a river you have always been swimming in. That river is not just words, it is a way of dividing the world. For much of the 20th century, linguists and psychologists debated whether the language you speak shapes what you can think. In the strongest form, this idea, sometimes associated with Benjamin Lee Whorf, suggested that our languages built our worldviews from the ground up. That view is now considered too strong by most researchers, but the softer version of it, that the language you inherit gently nudges the categories of your mind, has held up surprisingly well. Consider color. Many languages carve the visible spectrum into fewer or more categories than English does. Some languages, like Russian, have separate basic terms for lighter and darker blue. In experiments, Russian speakers can distinguish shades near that boundary a little faster than English speakers, whose language groups both under the single word blue. The physical eye is the same. The difference lives in the linguistic grip on what the eye sees. Consider time. In English, we naturally speak of the future as ahead and the past as behind. In some Andean languages, especially Aymara, the past is spoken of as being in front, because you can see it, you have already lived it, and the future is behind, because it is unseen. Speakers of these languages sometimes gesture that way when they talk about time, a different geometry of the self and the calendar, drawn without argument in the small motions of hands. Consider agency. Some languages, like English, encourage sentences such as "I broke the glass," where a person is clearly the actor. Other languages, like Spanish and Japanese, allow constructions closer to the glass broke itself, when the breaking was accidental. Studies by Lera Boroditsky and her colleagues have shown that these grammatical patterns subtly influence what speakers remember about accidental events, how strongly they encode who did what, how much blame settles in memory. Something about how you narrate a moment shapes how you carry it later. You did not choose the language you now think in. It was placed around you before you had opinions. A mother sang lullabies in it. A neighborhood called to you in it. Later, you learned to read and write in it, discovered your first love in it, first argued with your parents in it. By the time you were able to reflect on language at all, you were already an expert in one particular way of dividing existence, which means that many of the choices you will make tomorrow, especially the choices that involve interpretation, will be made through a lens whose grinding began before your birth. When you decide whether a friend meant to hurt you or not, when you consider whether a color match works, when you weigh whether the future is coming toward you or moving away, some of your instinctive judgments were sculpted by centuries of speakers who came before you and never knew your name. There is even research on how languages that grammatically emphasize the future, with tenses that clearly separate future events from present ones, may correlate with subtly different patterns in behaviors such as saving, health decisions, and long-term planning. These findings are debated, and the effects are small, but they suggest a soft possibility that the way your language treats tomorrow may shape, ever so lightly, how you approach it. None of this reduces your agency to a puppet show. Bilingual and multilingual people know intimately that switching languages can feel like changing the color of your inner room. But even that experience reveals the point. The rooms exist. The furniture is arranged before you step in, and once you step in, some of your thinking is already leaning. If a bootstrap is a choice whose origin cannot be cleanly located, then every judgment you make in your native tongue is a small, ordinary bootstrap. The language met you first. It shaped what you could easily notice, easily name, easily feel, and your choices, made in it, now travel forward into your children, your students, your writings, your quiet conversations with strangers. There is a soft comfort in this too. You are never entirely alone in your thoughts. Every sentence you form has been formed before, in outline, by others who reached, in their own centuries, for the same shapes. Even in your most private thinking, there is a companionship, a groove worn deep enough for many minds. You are only one of the travelers walking along it tonight. Try to remember, if you can, the age at which you were expected to do certain things. Not the age at which you actually did them, but the age at which the surrounding culture had quietly agreed that a person was supposed to do them: finish school, choose a career, fall in love, marry or not, have children or not, buy a home, recover from a loss, take up a hobby, retire. You did not sit down at 10 years old and think through this schedule. Nobody handed it to you as a printed list, and yet, if you listen closely, most people can feel it inside them. There is a sense of being on time, or ahead of time, or behind. There is a specific weight to being unmarried at a certain age in certain communities, or childless at another, or still figuring things out well past the moment the culture whispers that you should be settled. The calendar is invisible, but it is unmistakable. The psychologist Bernice Neugarten described this phenomenon in the 1960s as the social clock. She noticed that people in most cultures share widely held ideas about the appropriate ages for major life events, and that these expectations act as a soft framework guiding decisions and self-evaluation. When we are on time, we feel a certain ease. When we are off time, whether early or late, we often feel a low-grade dissonance that has less to do with what we actually want and more to do with what our culture has already implicitly scheduled. Rites of passage make this visible in ceremony. Coming-of-age rituals, whether religious or secular, mark boundaries a culture has drawn on the map of a life. The bar mitzvah, the quinceañera, the graduation, the wedding, the housewarming, the funeral. These are moments the community has agreed to notice. Around them cluster expectations, gifts, gestures. Even those who deliberately reject them are still defining themselves in relation to them. You cannot fully escape a schedule you have never explicitly agreed to. Now widen the frame a little. Even the emotions we experience at certain life stages have been shaped by cultural scripts. Grief for a lost parent in some cultures is expected to be loud, in others quiet. The way one is supposed to feel about aging varies enormously between societies. Some places treat elders as respected repositories of wisdom, and older people describe themselves as still climbing. Others treat aging as decline, and older people, breathing the same air, sometimes come to feel their own diminishment more sharply. None of this means that individual lives conform mechanically to their cultures. People marry late, refuse retirement, become parents at 60, leave stable careers at 40, quietly reject expected paths. And yet even these choices are made in dialogue with the script. The one who breaks the pattern is still shaped by knowing what the pattern is. The one who follows the pattern is often surprised by how much of it feels chosen, though it was never composed by them. Consider your own reflection tonight, without judgment. Notice which parts of your life felt, at the time, like natural sequences, obvious steps you did not have to invent. Perhaps entering school at the expected age, perhaps the summer job, perhaps the first serious relationship at a certain age, perhaps the moment you thought about a mortgage. Now notice how much of the obvious of those decisions was actually a very specific script, written by centuries of people you did not know, in cultures they never left, for reasons that may or may not resemble your own. And then notice, gently, how tomorrow's choice, the choice inside the envelope, is being made inside this script. When you deliberate about whether to change something in your life, part of the deliberation is between you and the moment, but part of it is between you and the invisible calendar you inherited. Every should in your head has a history. Every shouldn't has an origin. There is a strange kindness in seeing this. It means that some of the pressure you feel is not your own truth speaking. It is the residue of a community's timetable, and you are allowed, in a quiet way, to disagree with the timetable, at least in the privacy of your own night. Some have wondered whether real freedom is not the ability to escape all scripts, but the ability to hear which script is speaking. Once you can hear it, you can choose whether to say yes to that particular sentence, this time. You still live inside cultures, you still belong to a species that organizes lives in patterns, but you are no longer simply reciting. And so the loop softens into something almost tender. You are, in part, being written by centuries, and you are also, in the small hours of the night, quietly choosing which sentences of the inherited script you will speak in the morning, and which you will lay down. Now widen the frame as far as it will go, beyond ancestors, beyond languages, beyond calendars, out to the very edge of what physicists are willing to describe. In one of our best supported cosmological pictures, the universe you live inside had a beginning, roughly 13.8 billion years ago, in a state so dense and hot that the words we usually use begin to bend. In the first fractions of a second, according to the theory of cosmic inflation developed in the 1980s by Alan Guth, Andre Linde, and others, the universe underwent a period of extremely rapid expansion. During that brief burst, tiny quantum fluctuations were stretched to enormous scales, becoming the seeds of the structures we now see around us, the clusters of galaxies, the threads and voids of the cosmic web, the faint temperature variations in the cosmic microwave background, which have been mapped in exquisite detail by satellites like COBE, WMAP, and Planck. Those maps are extraordinary. What look like faint variations in temperature across the sky are, in fact, gentle memories of the fluctuations from the first moments. They match, remarkably well, what inflationary models predict. It is one of the more striking agreements in modern science, theory and observation shaking hands across billions of years. And here is the quiet awe. Every galaxy, every star, every possibility of a planet with the right combination of elements for chemistry, and eventually for life, and eventually for a body capable of holding a paper envelope in the dark, may trace its shape back to fluctuations in those first, unimaginably brief moments. In some sense, the general pattern of matter that would one day form your Milky Way, your sun, your planet, the atoms in your bones, was set in motion very, very early. You can feel where this leads. If the seeds were set so early, then in some very loose statistical sense, so was everything that could eventually grow from them. Not every detail, not every choice, not the color of your grandmother's kitchen, not the specific decision you will make tomorrow, but the outline of the possible, the ground on which everything, including you, would eventually stand. At this point, several important conversations open. Some physicists have observed that many of the constants of nature, the strength of gravity, the mass of certain particles, the way electromagnetism behaves, appear finely balanced in ways that permit complex chemistry and life. Change them by a small amount, and stars might never form, or atoms might never hold together. This is often called the fine-tuning problem, and here the conversation splits into several careful, respectful directions. Some physicists propose that our universe is only one of many in some vast collection of possible universes, and we simply happen to live in one whose constants allow for us. Others propose that some deeper theory, yet to be discovered, will explain why the constants take the values they do. Others hold that the fine-tuning points towards something more, that the parameters of the world are not simply accidents. This remains genuinely debated. Reasonable scientists disagree, reasonable philosophers disagree, and the question of ultimate origin, why there is something rather than nothing, and whether that something reflects a purpose or an intention beyond the reach of our instruments, remains outside what physics on its own is equipped to settle. What science can say, more modestly, is this: the universe you inhabit appears to be extraordinarily structured, extraordinarily old, extraordinarily wide, and extraordinarily well suited, at least in a few small places, for the emergence of self-aware creatures, whether that is astonishing luck, deep necessity, or the fingerprint of something beyond the equations. That question the theories do not close. Sit gently with the scale for a moment. The initial conditions of the universe were, in some sense, the first envelope. Every subsequent scene in the story of matter, the cooling, the first light, the birth of atoms, the assembling of galaxies, the death of ancient stars that scattered heavy elements outward, the eventual coalescing of the Earth from that debris, the strange chemistry that would one day become alive, all of it flows onward from that early moment, and the you who will make a choice tomorrow, in a body made of atoms forged in dying stars, is not floating apart from that story. You are one of its later paragraphs. None of this diminishes the meaning of your decision. If anything, it deepens it. Whatever choice you make, whatever tenderness or courage or restraint you offer, is offered by a being who is, in some literal sense, the universe becoming briefly aware of itself in a warm room at night. Whether that awareness was intended by something beyond it, or arose in ways we do not fully understand, or both, is a mystery held quietly open, and so the loop widens beyond what any single life can hold. The bootstrap of your ordinary decision, tomorrow, may in some sense participate in a much longer, much older bootstrap, one that includes the light of stars that no longer exist and the first brief breath of expansion in a universe that has not stopped unfolding since. There is one more strange corridor to visit before we begin to fold this chapter down. It is a corridor built entirely from thought experiment, and it must be entered carefully because it is easy to mistake it for a claim about reality. In 2003, the philosopher Nick Bostrom published a paper that has since traveled widely. In it, he outlined what has come to be called the simulation argument. The reasoning goes roughly as follows. If, in the future, any civilization ever develops the ability to run detailed simulations of conscious beings, and if such civilizations run many of them, then the number of simulated conscious beings might eventually far outnumber the biological ones. And if that is so, then any given conscious being, including you, tonight, would, by simple probability, more likely be one of the simulated ones than one of the originals. This is not a claim that we are in a simulation. Bostrom himself was careful. His argument was that at least one of several possibilities must be true. Either civilizations tend to go extinct before they develop such simulations, or civilizations that could develop them choose not to, or a substantial portion of what we call reality is such a simulation. Which of these is actually the case, he did not claim to know. The simulation argument has been criticized on many grounds. Some argue that it makes assumptions about consciousness that we have no way to verify. Others question whether such simulations, even if possible, would ever actually produce genuine inner experience. Others still argue that the whole scenario, while intellectually interesting, is not testable in any real sense, and therefore not properly a scientific claim at all. The question of whether the universe could ever be simulated, or already is, remains firmly in the territory of speculation rather than established knowledge. But even as speculation, it does something interesting to the concept of a bootstrap. If you imagine, purely as a thought experiment, a universe running inside a simulation, then the origin of every event inside that universe becomes a strange nested question. Choices arise inside a system whose rules were written elsewhere. The past that appears to you may not be a past that was ever fully lived from moment to moment, but a set of consistent conditions inserted into the world when your particular process began. In such a picture, some of the paradoxes of self-authorship become almost trivial, loops within loops within loops. There is a companion image that is much older and in some ways gentler. The cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter, in his book Gödel, Escher, Bach, and later in I Am a Strange Loop, developed the idea that the self is a kind of self-referential pattern. When a system becomes complex enough to represent itself inside itself, to think about its own thinking, to see itself as a character in its own story, a strange loop is formed. The knot of I appears. Consciousness, in Hofstadter's view, is what it feels like from the inside to be such a loop. You do not need to accept the whole of Hofstadter's view to feel the tug of it. Notice that as you lie in this bed, you are able to notice yourself lying in this bed. You can think about your thinking. You can wonder about wondering. Whatever else the self is, it is a system that has the strange ability to bend back and take itself as its own object. The very grammar of I am is a loop, a sentence whose subject includes the noticing of itself. This is another version of the bootstrap, not in physics laboratories, not in ancestral chemistry, but in the small ordinary architecture of what it feels like to be someone. Your eye points to something that is doing the pointing. There is no clean outside point from which the eye is being defined. Every attempt to describe yourself becomes part of yourself. None of this proves that reality is a simulation, or that the universe is a mind reflecting on itself, or that the world is a text written by another author. These are among the more speculative ideas in philosophy and physics, and they should be held loosely. They are lit candles, not certified maps, but they widen, one more time, the sense of what the ordinary act of choosing might sit inside. At this point, the loops we have gathered are stacking gently, choices influenced by ancestral chemistry, choices influenced by prenatal exposure, choices shaped by temperament and by predictive brains, choices woven into the fabric of a possibly block-shaped time, choices whose past is quietly softened by delayed measurements, choices made by bodies whose rhythms rehearse them in sleep. choices spoken in languages shaped centuries ago, choices timed by invisible cultural clocks, choices arising in a universe whose seeds were laid in the first moments of everything, and, if some thought experiments have any weight at all, choices possibly nested inside larger systems whose scale is not ours to see. None of these arrays you, each of them companions you, and each of them, in its own quiet way, softens the notion that a choice was ever simply the property of one lone actor in an empty room. The envelope on the nightstand does not feel any heavier for all of this. If anything, it feels more familiar. It is the kind of object a life like yours was always going to include. And your hand, when it finally reaches for it, will reach with the whole of this history in it, gently. Now step into a picture that is much more speculative, but often deeply loved by those who first encounter it. It comes from a corner of physics called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. In the mid-20th century, a young physicist named Hugh Everett proposed a strange and elegant reading of quantum theory. In standard quantum mechanics, when a measurement is made, the many possible outcomes seem to collapse into a single one. The electron ends up here, not there, and everything else vanishes as possibility. Everett suggested a different way of taking the equations seriously. What if nothing ever collapses at all? What if, at every moment when the world could go one way or another, it goes both ways, and the universe itself branches? In one branch, the electron lands here. In another, it lands there. Each branch continues on, real and complete, with its own version of you inside it. The idea sat quietly for decades, considered too strange by most physicists, before being taken up again in the 1970s, and later, especially by researchers like David Deutsch, who explored its implications for quantum computing. Today, many worlds is one of several serious interpretations of quantum mechanics, alongside others. It is not proven, it cannot easily be tested, if it can be tested at all. But it is not dismissed by every physicist either. It sits, respectably, as one candidate for what the mathematics might mean. Try, for a moment, to imagine what the picture suggests. If it is true, then every possibility that could have happened at the quantum level, and by extension every branching of a larger event, produces its own line of the world. Somewhere out in that vast, unreachable landscape, there might be branches in which you never entered the room you are in tonight. Branches in which you took a different job, married a different person, spoke a different first language, chose a different city to fall asleep in. It is important to hold this picture carefully. It is a philosophical possibility, not a proven fact about reality. Nothing in current science shows, and nothing may ever show, that other versions of you actually exist. Even physicists who find many worlds compelling as an interpretation are usually careful to distinguish between the mathematics of the theory and the metaphysical claim that other yous are living, breathing lives elsewhere. The equations at most describe a wave function that branches. Whether those branches host separate conscious beings or are only mathematical shadows remains a genuinely open question. Even as speculation, the many worlds image does something interesting to the idea of choice. In an ordinary decision, should I say yes, should I say no, you experience one path being chosen and the other one closing behind you. In the many worlds picture, no path is closed. Each path simply becomes the road of a different branch. The you who makes this choice is not alone in a lit corridor. The you who makes this choice is one of many yous, each in a slightly different corridor, each convinced that theirs is the corridor that actually happened. Some find this comforting. It suggests that every kindness you did not extend was extended somewhere. Every mistake you fear you made was not made in some other branch. Others find it disturbing. If every choice is made in every direction, does any single choice mean as much as we thought? But there is another way to hold it. Even inside many worlds, this particular branch, the one where you are now, is unmistakably real. It is the one you are living. It is the only one you are ever going to touch. Whatever might exist elsewhere, it does not touch your hand tonight. Your choices in this branch are still yours to make, and their weight in this branch is still complete. There is a soft, humbling image here. Imagine each life not as a single line, but as a branch in an unimaginably large library, where every possible book has some form of existence, and each conscious being is one reader in one chair, in one alcove, reading only one book at a time. Whether the library actually exists in that literal way, or whether the library is only a metaphor for what the equations gently allow, is not for any of us to settle tonight. And so the loop widens once more. It suggests that the bootstrap of your ordinary decisions may not be a single closed circle, but a network of paths, in which the choices you make now are gently entangled, in ways beyond our full description, with everything you might have chosen. It is a picture that invites humility more than certainty, and it leaves the deepest question of what and who a self ultimately is, across such branches, respectfully open. Sometimes thought experiments become miniature homes for very serious ideas, and one of the strangest of these, closely related to the many worlds interpretation, is called quantum immortality. It must be handled gently, because it is easy to mistake it for a claim about what actually happens to a person when they die. That is not what it is. The scenario originates in the writings of the physicist Max Tegmark and other theorists who took the many worlds interpretation to some of its more extreme logical corners. In its usual telling, it goes something like this. Imagine a thought experiment in which a person is faced with a quantum-based random event that could, at each attempt, either continue their life or end it. In the many worlds picture, at each attempt, the world branches. In some branches, the event ends the life. In others, the event does not. The consciousness of the person, if there is any continuity of consciousness at all, could only ever find itself in a branch where the life continued, because in the other branches there is no experiencer left to notice. Extend this indefinitely, and you arrive at a strange conclusion. From the first-person perspective inside a many worlds framework, some have wondered whether a person's own subjective experience could always follow the branches in which they survive, no matter how improbable. In this way, they would never, from their own point of view, encounter their own death. It is important to be very careful with this. Quantum immortality is not a scientific claim about what actually happens to any real being when they die. It is a philosophical extrapolation from an already speculative interpretation of quantum theory. It relies on assumptions about consciousness, about whether it can straightforwardly ride branches, about what a subjective viewpoint even means across such structures, that we have no reliable way to test or verify. Most careful thinkers regard it as a puzzle to think with, not a picture of reality. And in traditions that speak of the soul, of accountability, of what awaits after this life, quantum immortality does not have the standing to displace or contradict any of these deeper questions. Science can watch bodies, it can measure brainwaves, it can trace in beautiful detail the physical processes of dying, but what a self ultimately is, and where it truly goes when the body no longer sustains it, is not a matter the instruments have settled. The instruments observe, they do not conclude. So why sit with this thought experiment at all? Because it can offer something quiet and useful when held in the right way. It can gently loosen the grip of certain assumptions that ordinarily seem obvious. We tend to imagine that our first-person experience is a simple, single thread. Quantum immortality, as a puzzle, invites us to notice that we do not actually know how a first-person perspective would behave across branchings, across replicas, across the strange possibilities the mathematics of certain physics theories describes. It reminds us of the humility we owe to the largest questions. There is another, gentler use for it. In the ordinary rhythm of a life, we tend to fear the endings of things, the endings of relationships, of jobs, of seasons, and eventually of ourselves. Some of that fear is wise and functional. Some of it, though, is a rigidity of imagination. Puzzles like quantum immortality do not banish fear, nor should they. But they can, for some minds, quietly indicate that the picture of what an ending is may not be as simple as the mind assumes. The self, in whatever way it exists, may not fit neatly into the categories we usually use for it. Notice that we are not being told what awaits any of us. We are not being told how to think about our own mortality. We are only being offered a slight softening of certainty. It is the same softening that runs through many parts of modern physics and modern philosophy. The world is deeper than our diagrams. The self is deeper than our labels. What we truly are, and what we truly become, remains one of the great open questions, treated respectfully by careful thinkers of many traditions. And so, when a small hour of the night brings up the thought of endings, as sometimes it does, this is a place where the mind can rest for a moment without hurrying to a conclusion. The instruments only see so much. The heart, the mind, the story you are inside, is more than what any single theory can name. Whatever the ultimate shape of the self, tonight the body rests, the room is calm, and the questions themselves are gently allowed to remain open. The bootstrap loops keep turning, in physics, in biology, in imagination, and you are still here, listening, in the very ordinary miracle of one warm night. Let us come back from those very high-thought experiments to something more intimate. What, exactly, is the you that would supposedly be present across so many branches, or across the years of an ordinary life? The word I is used so casually that it becomes invisible, but philosophers, and now neuroscientists, have taken it seriously enough to design experiments that gently unsettle it. The philosopher Derek Parfit devoted a large portion of his career to what is sometimes called personal identity across time. He asked deceptively simple questions. Suppose one day a machine could scan your entire body and brain in perfect detail. Suppose it could then instantly transport a perfect physical replica of you to another planet. Same memories, same personality, same nervous system, same feelings. Suppose that in the process, the original body here on Earth is dissolved. Now ask, is the person who steps out of the machine on the other planet you or someone else? Parfit noticed that our intuitions pull in different directions. On one hand, everything that seems to make you you, your memories, your relationships, your habits, has travelled. On the other hand, this new being was assembled somewhere else, and the person who stepped in has been undone. In some versions of the experiment, both the original and a replica exist simultaneously. In such cases, which one is really you? Parfit's answer, developed over many years, was surprising. He came to believe that the strict question of "is it me?" may be less well defined than we tend to assume. What matters, he suggested, is not some rigid identity, but continuity, of memory, of personality, of intention, of what he called psychological connectedness. Identity, in this view, is less like a solid object and more like a river. A river is not the same water from moment to moment, and yet it is meaningfully the same river. Selves may be more like rivers than like statues. Now bring this closer to the body. In the mid-20th century, researchers Roger Sperry and later Michael Gazzaniga studied patients whose corpus callosum, the thick bridge of fibers connecting the two hemispheres of the brain, had been severed as a treatment for severe epilepsy. In carefully designed experiments, they found something quietly astonishing. In these patients, the two hemispheres could, in certain conditions, seem to perceive different things and even reach different conclusions. One hemisphere might read a word, the other could not consciously report. The two halves of the brain, in these cases, seem to host slightly different centers of processing, only loosely aware of each other. The implications for the ordinary sense of self were not lost on Gazzaniga. He proposed that even in the intact brain, what we experience as a unified self may be, in part, a narrative constructed by a particular interpreter module in the left hemisphere. This interpreter takes the many streams of information from all over the brain and stitches them into a story with a single main character. That character is you, or rather, the coherent you know from the inside. If that is even partly true, then the you who will make a choice tomorrow is not one clear, unified voice speaking from one clear, unified place. It is in a sense a coalition. Many systems in the brain, sensory, emotional, memory, motor, bring their inputs to the table. The interpreter listens and in real time drafts a story in which the coalition speaks with one voice. The story is smooth, the underlying reality is more like a soft parliament. Once again the bootstrap shape appears. Where did the story of you begin? It cannot be pinned to a first neuron, or a first breath, or a first thought. It is a continuous, ongoing act of composition, shaped by memory being reconstructed each time you use it, by predictions the brain has already drafted, by inputs from below the neck, and by long echoes from ancestral bodies and languages. The self is not so much a thing as an ongoing verb, yet something remarkable persists. Despite all this, most of the time, you experience yourself as a single continuous being. You remember, more or less, being a child. You expect, more or less, to be here tomorrow. There is a real center of gravity that holds you together through days and years and losses. Whatever the underlying architecture, the felt reality of I is not a nothing. It is one of the most persistent and precious phenomena of a human life. Perhaps the honest thing to say is that the self is both. A story constructed moment by moment out of many streams, and a real, felt, unshakably present center of a life. The instruments see the streams. What is beyond the streams, what integrates them, what gives them the weight of being someone, remains a question that reasonable thinkers have never fully closed. So when tomorrow's choice arrives, it will not be made by a single isolated point. It will be made by this river, this parliament, this ongoing composition, and it will still, unmistakably, be yours. Whatever you ultimately is, it is what you have. It is what tonight is offered to. It is what tomorrow is entrusted with. There is a particular kind of moment that visits most lives at least once. Sometimes it comes at a very ordinary time. You turn a corner in a foreign city, and someone is standing there whom you needed, at that exact instant, to meet. Sometimes it comes as a strange coincidence of numbers, of names, of songs, of dreams. Sometimes it comes as an event so precisely aligned to a private question you have been carrying that you can only sit with it, quietly, unsure what to say. Cultures have many names for these moments: grace, fate, kismet, the feeling of meant to be. Even in secular contexts, people often reach for words like uncanny, striking, remarkable, without being able to fully explain them. Something inside us has noticed a pattern that our ordinary language does not quite capture. The psychiatrist Carl Jung, in the mid-20th century, coined a word for a specific kind of these experiences. He called them synchronicities. He defined them as meaningful coincidences that do not fit into ordinary chains of cause and effect. A patient telling him about a golden scarab in a dream, at the very moment a live beetle happened to arrive at his window. A person seeing the same rare object 3 times in 1 week, exactly when their thoughts turned toward it. Jung believed these events were more than random. He suspected there was an underlying layer of reality where the outer world and the inner world corresponded in ways he could not fully explain. Modern psychology has been careful about synchronicity. Researchers have noted quite correctly that our brains are pattern-hungry. We remember hits and forget misses. We notice striking coincidences because they stand out, and we underestimate how many coincidences chance alone can produce over a long life. Statistically, if you have thousands of experiences per day, some of them will occasionally line up in ways that feel meaningful. That is not proof of a hidden order. It may only be proof of a wide life. And yet, even after all the caution, the felt quality of these moments does not entirely dissolve. People often say that after such an experience, something in them changed. A decision became clearer, a fear softened, a step forward felt possible. Whether or not the coincidence itself was meant, the response to it can be very real. The moment was not merely noticed, it was received. This is a place where wonder and skepticism can coexist. Skepticism reminds us that our minds construct meaning easily, and that we should not build large claims on small events. Wonder reminds us that meaning itself is not nothing. When a life is nudged by a coincidence, and the nudge leads toward more kindness, more courage, more clarity, whether the coincidence was written by anything or by no one, the person who followed it may be genuinely different afterward. Some traditions frame such moments as gentle signs of a larger arrangement. In many spiritual paths, they are described as glimpses of a world in which things are more connected than they appear from the ground. Other traditions frame them as beautiful accidents that we then decorate with meaning, because meaning is what we most need. It is not necessary to choose between these framings tonight. It is possible to hold both, softly, and to remain honest. What matters, for our purposes, is that the feeling of being chosen, the sensation that something more than yourself has arranged the moment, is a very real part of many human lives, and it participates in the loop we have been tracing. When such a moment happens, the choice you make afterward is not simply from your isolated will. It is a response to a felt call, Whether that call is voiced by a coincidence, an intuition, a dream, a strange arrangement of the day, or by something you cannot name at all, it becomes one more contributor to the decision. Notice how many of your own past choices were nudged this way. The friend you met by chance who turned out to be pivotal, the book that fell open at the sentence you needed, the advice a stranger gave that arrived at exactly the right moment. Some of these you might attribute to luck, some to intuition, some to something more. Whatever the framing, the experience of being chosen has already been part of the shape of your life. If a bootstrap paradox is a choice with no clean origin, then the felt sense of being called is one of its most ordinary human versions. Someone or something, the universe, chance, the deep patterns of a life, or perhaps something beyond all these, seem to arrive with an offer. And you, in your quiet way, said yes. You do not have to know exactly what said it to notice that you responded. In this respect, we are never simply the sole authors of our lives. We are also its listeners, and listening, sometimes, is the deepest kind of choice we ever make. Let us stop, for a moment, and look at where we have arrived. We have found choices that echo through ancestors, through language, through the invisible calendar of cultures. We have found preparations for tomorrow, written into the body's chemistry hours before dawn. We have followed the strangeness of physics into loops in space-time, and into the softening of the past under quantum measurement. We have wandered into the very edges of thought experiment, where selves branch or nest inside larger patterns, and we have listened to the small, real experience of being nudged by coincidences that no clean theory can dismiss. Through all of this, one thing has remained: the everyday, unmistakable sense of being someone, the sense of being a self who is aware, who is here, who is choosing, in some real and honest way, tomorrow. And here, gently, we come to a threshold, because if you follow the loops back far enough, through the body, through the ancestors, through the language, through the culture, through the initial conditions of the universe, you eventually reach a place where honest science ends. The instruments observe, they do not conclude. Physics gives us equations, sometimes staggering ones, about how things behave. It does not, at least not yet, tell us why anything is here at all, or what, if anything, holds the whole loom together. There is a very old question that has been asked in every human culture. If a life is shaped by so many prior causes, genes, upbringing, environment, physics, chance, is there anything left inside the self that is truly ours? And beyond that, is there something behind all of these causes, or does the chain simply extend backward without a beginning we can point to? Careful thinkers have offered many answers. Some argue that everything ultimately reduces to physics and chance, and that the sense of being someone is only a very sophisticated pattern in matter. Others argue that consciousness itself is a fundamental feature of reality, not reducible to anything simpler. Others hold, along with many spiritual traditions, that behind all the visible loops there is a creator, a source, or a mind whose existence gives all the smaller stories their weight. Still others hold that the deepest truth is more mysterious than any of these positions, and that honest humility is the only stance the human mind can fully afford. We are not going to try to settle that question tonight. It would be dishonest to pretend that any short conversation could. What can be said quietly is this: the picture painted by modern science, taken at its most rigorous, does not close the door on any of these possibilities. Nothing in what we have explored proves that the loops are all there is. Nothing in what we have explored proves that behind the loops there is a mind. Nothing forbids either possibility. The door remains open, held ajar by the very limits of what our instruments can see. And so, when you feel, at the end of a long day, that you are more than the sum of your genetic inheritance and cultural scripts, that intuition is not automatically wrong, when you feel, in a quiet moment, that something larger is present in your life, that intuition is not automatically right or wrong either, the honest scientist, at their most honest, and the honest mystic, at theirs, sometimes end their sentences in the same place, a soft ellipsis where the language runs out. There is a great deal of comfort in this. It means we do not have to force our lives into either a purely mechanical picture or a purely magical one. We can live inside a world that is patterned enough to be studied and mysterious enough to be honored. We can accept that our choices are shaped by many things beyond our full sight, and still make them tenderly, still take responsibility for them, still love and be loved as if it all mattered, because it does matter. Whatever the ultimate origin of the loop, this evening is real. This breath is real. The small movement of your chest as you settle further into the pillow is real. The way you feel, or do not feel, that you are held is real. Whatever you turn out to have been, from a vantage point far larger than the one you now inhabit, the fact of your being here, tonight, listening, wondering, still choosing, is not a nothing. It is one of the truest things there is. And so we leave this chapter with a soft honesty. The author of your life may not be only you, but it is not less than you either. Whatever else stands behind the shape of your existence, genes, ancestors, physics, culture, chance, and perhaps something beyond all of them that instruments cannot see, you are the one who is now living the sentence. You are the one who is now, gently, being trusted with the pen. Return for a moment to the envelope on the nightstand. It is still there. Its paper has cooled slightly. The room has settled around it. And you, having wandered through generations and geometries and quiet laboratories, are back to something very small, a letter and a hand and a hush. You do not have to open it tonight. You do not have to decide what the letter says. All that has quietly changed is your relationship to what it might contain. Whatever tomorrow's choice turns out to be, you have seen, softly, how many hands may have contributed to it. A grandparent's winter, still writing in your body. A voice heard through fluid, becoming the shape of what makes you feel safe. A temperament sketched in the first months of your life. A language that carved certain shapes of thinking before you knew what thinking was. A culture that whispered when things ought to happen. A universe whose first moments arranged the elements from which your bones are made. A brain that has been drafting the choice for longer than you were aware. A heart that has been leaning toward it in ways science can still only partly describe. And perhaps something beyond all these, a source, a companion, a presence that no instrument can measure and no equation can name, has also been part of the writing. Or perhaps not. That door is left honestly open. None of this removes the choice from your hand. None of this makes tomorrow less real. The sentence may have been begun long before you, but you are the one who will now speak its next word. You are the one who is here to feel the small stir of the day. You are the one whose gentle attention will meet what arrives. There is a strange dignity in being a middle line in a long sentence. You are not the beginning. You may not be the end, but without you, the whole sentence would lose one of its notes. Whatever comes tomorrow, its music, in some small way, depends on you. The envelope, if we let it, is no longer a threat. It is not a message from a stranger telling you what you have to do. It is more like a note left by many kind hands over many centuries, resting on your bedside, and reading, in your own quiet handwriting, simply this: you are still allowed to live. There is a habit of mind that most of us have been taught to admire, the habit of certainty. The friend who has a firm opinion about everything, the teacher who knows the answers, the system that leaves no question unresolved. Certainty, we are told, is strength. Uncertainty, we are told, is weakness. And so much of ordinary life is spent trying to be, or at least seem, more certain than we actually are. But listen to the honest scientist for a moment, and you will hear something different. In the middle of the most rigorous work, there is a soft phrase that keeps appearing. It seems that. It may be, current evidence suggests. This model is one possibility among several. Even at the frontiers of physics, at the edges of what human beings have ever known, the most careful minds do not speak in exclamation marks. They speak in patient sentences, willing to be revised. Listen also to the honest mystic. In every deep spiritual tradition, alongside the great truths that are taught, there is a quiet acknowledgement that the ultimate is beyond words. The Tao that can be spoken of is not the eternal Tao. The mystery is greater than the description. Silence, at the deepest levels, is not an absence of meaning. It is a mode of reverence. In this way, the honest scientist and the honest mystic sometimes end their sentences with the same quiet ellipsis, not because they have failed, but because they have arrived at a place where the small human languages we have built cannot fully hold what they are trying to say. Not knowing, in that light, is not a defeat. It is one of the deepest gifts of a thinking life. It is the space in which wonder is possible. It is the room where new questions can be born. It is the reason a life, no matter how long, cannot ever grow entirely tired, because there is always something more underneath. And there is a personal comfort in this too. You are not required to have every answer about your own life. You are not required to fully understand why you became the person you became, or why certain events arranged themselves as they did, or what will happen next. Some things can remain quietly unknown, without needing to be resolved before you can sleep. Perhaps the deepest peace is not in knowing everything, but in trusting that not everything must be known before you rest. If the loop in some form is real, if part of tomorrow is already circulating in your body and your history, that does not have to feel like a cage. It can, if you let it, feel more like a companion. Think of the small, ordinary choices of a life, the way you spoke gently to a stranger yesterday, the way you paused this evening before saying something sharp, the way you turned towards someone you love, even when you were tired, the way you have shown up, quietly, for people whose names may never appear in any record. These moments do not become smaller if we discover that a great deal of you was shaped by things you did not choose. They become, in a strange way, more valuable, because inside a pattern that stretches farther than any life, you still added your particular tenderness. Inside a world of forces and inheritances, you still chose which sentence, of the many you could have spoken, would leave your mouth today. That is not nothing. That is one of the most human things there is. There is an old, gentle way of holding this. Perhaps the sense of freedom we most deeply care about is not the freedom to author every note of the song. Perhaps it is the freedom to sing, warmly, the notes we have been given. Freedom, in this quiet sense, is not the absence of pattern. It is the presence of care inside it. And care is remarkably yours. No inheritance, no equation, no initial condition dictates the exact softness with which you will speak to the person beside you tomorrow morning. That softness, if it comes, will be your contribution. It will be the one place in the whole loop where your fingerprint is entirely fresh. So let the loop be what it is. Let the forces be what they are. Let the universe carry the weight of its long, patient story. And you, quietly, decide only this, that you will bring, into the little space of your own hours, the kindness you have. That is not a small choice. It is one of the largest gestures a life is capable of making, and it may be the truest form of authorship you have. Now the room is quieter. Your breath has slowed, though you did not tell it to. The blanket is warmer than it was earlier. The envelope on the nightstand is still there, but somehow it has become friendly. It is only a piece of paper. It is only tomorrow. It will wait for you. The great loops we have wandered through are still turning, softly, in their own places. The stars that made your atoms are still there, in the wide sky above the roof. The ancestors whose lives shaped some of your reflexes are quiet now, resting in the long past. The languages you speak are still walking, in other people's rooms, in other cities, doing their gentle work. The choices you will make tomorrow are still ahead, waiting patiently, unhurried. You do not have to reach for any of them tonight. You do not have to solve the paradox. You do not have to decide what the letter says. Everything you have learnt this evening will settle inside you, in its own time, without your effort. Some of it your body already knows how to keep. Let your shoulders release, just a little more. Notice how your face is softer than it was an hour ago. Notice how the space between your eyebrows has quietly opened. Notice the small weight of your head on the pillow, held gently by everything underneath it. Even now, without any effort from you, the deep systems that carry you are already doing their careful work. Your heart is beating, kindly, without needing your instruction. Your breath is rising and falling, in a rhythm older than any thought. The tiny clocks in your cells are turning toward morning, at their own pace. You do not have to help. You are being carried. If any thought comes up, let it drift through, like a small cloud crossing a dark window. You do not have to follow it. You can simply notice it, and let it pass. The night will hold whatever needs to be held. Whatever loops through you tonight, you are safe inside them. The universe you belong to is not against you. The story you are inside is not finished with you. The choices that lie ahead, however they were shaped, will be met by a self that has been quietly loved by many things it could not see. Rest now. Let the room become soft around you. Let the words you have heard become like gentle waves, moving farther away. There is nothing more you need to do. There is nowhere else you need to be. There is only this warm, ordinary miracle, one breath, and then another, and the slow, easy falling of your mind into sleep. Everything will be here in the morning. The envelope, the world, the long, patient story you are part of, and you will meet it, kindly, when you wake. For now, only rest, only rest.